A lot of young people today correctly say, what is conservatism conserving? I mean, they make fun of us. They say you're not really conservatives, and there is some truth to that accusation because if you're 35 years old and you're not you're not getting married and you're not having kids and all you care about is is how famous you're going to be and where your career is taking you, you can't be a conservative. I mean, you can be someone who conservatives like to listen to on podcasts, but you can't be a conservative person. Conservative person is someone who leads a conservative life. Conservative life is a life of transmission, like I said, and don't think you know how to do that because you read a couple of parenting books. It's much, much harder than you think.
Howdy, everyone, and welcome back to Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. My name is Saurabh Sharma. I'm the president of American Moment, and I'm joined by
Nick Solheim, the COO of American Moment.
And we have a fantastic episode for you guys today, one that's been a long time coming, but unfortunately our guest is usually not in the United States, and so it took a while for us to grab him while he is stateside. We had on today Dr. Yoram Hazony, who is, among other things, the president of the Herzl Institute in Jerusalem, the chairman of the Edmund Burke Foundation, which puts on the National Conservatism Conference that many of you have probably been to. He's the host of NatCon Talk and the author of two recent books, The Revelation at Sinai, What Does Torah from Heaven mean? And more importantly, for the purposes of this conversation, Conservatism, a Rediscovery. It's a chunky tome, and I'm only just now working my way through it, but Dr. Hazony has a lot to say about sort of where the conservative movement went wrong, where it's gone right, and what the future of conservatism might be. And so we enjoyed a really broad-ranging conversation on both his background, why he's personally a conservative, what motivated him to write this book, what the future of the right needs to be, what his home country of Israel, where he spends most of his time, is like. And, for many of his critics, we also asked, why is someone who spends most of his time living in Israel got so much to say about American nationalism? So he answered that question in good faith, along with many others. I don't know. What did you think about it, Nick?
It was a really great episode. I've really enjoyed Dr. Hazony's work for a long time. He strikes me as he does a lot. He does a lot of things, as Saurabh just read his bio.
9 kids.
Yeah, he's got like 9 kids, doing a ton of different jobs, just writing books willy-nilly. But one of the first, books I read when we kind of started to prepare the launch of American Moment was the Virtues of Nationalism, which was a truly fantastic, just really set my mind on kind of the issues that we're really concerned about here at American Moment, and learning more about how nationalism is an issue of the heart instead of the mind. It's not knowing statistics, not knowing specific policies, but it's how you feel about your country. And so I've always been deeply appreciative of Dr. Hazony's work, and I'm really excited to have him on the show today.
Yeah, and so as always, go to AmericanMoment.org to see everything else we have cooking. Rate and review this podcast 5 stars. But for now, we'll go straight to Dr. Yoram Hazony. Dr. Hazony, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Sure, my pleasure.
You're finally in Washington, D.C., which is why we were very excited to have you on. We could have done this remote at some point over the last year and a half, but it just didn't feel right. So we're glad to have you in studio. Tell us a little bit about your background, because it's certainly an interesting one. Your history being involved in American conservatism is long, and I think that story would really be edifying to our viewers and listeners. Tell us how you got here.
Okay, sure. I should say I have a new book coming out, Conservatism, a Rediscovery, and the book has an autobiographical chapter which just does this. It tells how my wife and I in college, how we became, how we joined up with the conservative movement, and there was a religious revival at the time. These were the Reagan Thatcher years, the end of the Cold War. John Paul II was the first Polish Pope, which was this very, very dramatic religious moment. And at Princeton, there was a multi-denominational political and religious revival going on. There were Catholics, Protestants, Jews who were inspired by that movement. Also called itself, Let's Make America Great Again.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the original Let's Make America Great Again. As far as I know, I had that poster on my wall during the Reagan, when I was in high school, during the Reagan campaign. And when we got to Princeton, it was just a few months after we got there that Julie, later my wife, that Julie and I went to New York City to the Institute for Educational Affairs, which was Irving Kristol's outfit, and we're looking for support to start a conservative publication at Princeton, which became the Princeton Tory. The biggest influences in those days, and people are going to be surprised, but Irving Kristol, the father of neoconservatism, was, what we would call a NatCon today. The neoconservative movement has gone in a very different direction, but in those days, and in my book, I bring, lengthy quotations from Kristol, the father, and George Will's writings were also national conservative. And, I don't know how he feels about it today. I assume that, he's certainly in a very, very different place. But for those of us at that time who were looking to connect to, the Anglo-American nationalist tradition and the tradition of public religion in America, people forget that the Reagan alliance was a very significant part of the Reagan alliance was people like Jerry Falwell and Billy Graham, and the socially, culturally, religious conservative wing of Reaganism was powerful and outspoken, and Reagan was a wholehearted supporter of that. Reagan, one of his early acts was to propose a constitutional amendment to put prayer back in the public school system in the United States. And one of his first acts in terms of foreign policy was to, when he came into office, he was a big emotional supporter, I think, not just intellectually, of the Polish uprising. The Solidarity movement was, it wasn't a trade union; it was an unofficial political party, and it was an uprising against communism. People think that's about personal freedom today, but when you were there, when you saw it, what was really going on was it was sparked by the first Polish Pope coming to Poland, and it was an immensely religious Catholic event, and it was nationalist. It was Catholic nationalist. It was about the independence of Catholic Poland, and Reagan was, although his background was Irish, he was wholeheartedly behind this. When he came into office, he asked to be briefed about Poland every day on a daily basis. So he and Thatcher and the Pope were fueling a religious nationalist uprising in Eastern Europe. And if you think it was just about Eastern Europe, when it got to the Falklands War, it was it was the opportunity for Reagan to show that his nationalism extended to Britain and the United States. Despite the fact that in a lot of ways it was not helpful to American foreign policy, but the United States got behind Britain in that war. And I think the way that Reagan understood it was that Britain had kind of been on a slide into feeling irrelevant, feeling everything had been lost, at least since the 1950s, since Suez. And Reagan saw, I think, in Thatcher the potential to turn Britain into a powerful, serious ally. And the way that he did it was to back this war, and the fact that Britain could project power on the other side of the globe still, and win a war with smaller forces that nobody thought they could win. All of this was part of a consistent program of trying to give moral strength and passion to Western nations, to Western nationalism, and to the alliance of Western nations. And as I said before, religion was an integral part of this. So we started this magazine, which was a full-throated Reaganite publication, except that it's not what people mean by Reaganite today. Of course, all of us did read Milton Friedman, and there was plenty of that. But on the other hand, Reagan was no ideologue in that direction either. When he needed to put up tariffs, he did put up tariffs for steel and automobiles, and there was never a moment that people doubted that his concern was for the American nation broadly, which meant not just fat cats, but the but working Americans. That's who he spoke to. Mm-hmm. So at Princeton, we were inspired. We put out this publication, but a big theme in my book is about being personally conservative. That is, it's not enough to be really good, appear on podcasts saying I support pro-family policies or pro-worker policies or something like that. You have to live the life, and I think that's kind of been lost. Conservatism is about a transmission, an active transmission, reception, restoration, transmission of what's good and beautiful in the traditions of our forefathers, and that's something that you can't just do by reading a book. Mm. You can only learn how to do that by being part of an active community that is daily working on transmission. And
practically speaking, where do you think people will ultimately fall if they simply ape the policy ideas and the political principles but don't live it out themselves?
Well, I think that's a lot of the story of mm-hmm. of post-war conservatism is that if you want to understand the 1960s and Buckley, you have to understand that this was a world in which liberal assumptions had already had already won after World War II, and people just sort of assumed that you could leave religion and nationalism and tradition and belief in God and Scripture. They just assumed that it was so strong in America. They thought you could just leave it to the to people's private lives, and it would just sort of happen by itself. Everybody switched into this mode of thinking about public policy and privatizing any issues that were too sensitive. And look, the 1960s conservatism, it had its big achievements. That is the force that ultimately won the Cold War. But it failed entirely in being able to preserve families. We shouldn't even talk about preserving it. It failed in allowing for the flourishing of families. It failed to allow for the flourishing of religion, and you just have to look at the elimination of God and Scripture from the American school system. A completely crazy revolutionary kind of thing. People believed the church was enough, and it's nowhere near enough. So I think the answer is pretty straightforward. A lot of young people today correctly say, what is conservatism conserving? I mean, they make fun of us. They say you're not really conservatives, and there is some truth to that accusation because if you're 35 years old and you're not getting married and you're not having kids and all you care about is how famous you're going to be and where your career is taking you, you can't be a conservative. I mean, you can be someone who conservatives like to listen to on podcasts, but you can't be a conservative person. Conservative person is someone who leads a conservative life. Conservative life is a life of transmission, like I said, and don't think you know how to do that because you read a couple of parenting books. It's much, much harder than you think.
I think this has been a very interesting theme that I've started to see in this, conservative movement, especially over the last year or two, is that a lot of our policy positions have almost become like technocratic because there's not a lot of heart, soul, feeling behind it. And so we turn to these kind of like, well, if we tweak the child tax credit exactly this way, or like do this thing exactly this way, then maybe people will have families. And I remember reading your first book, and you talked, about how nationalism is an issue of the heart, not of the mind. It's not like a thing that you can just build if you get the policies exactly right. It's a feeling. It's something that you have to really engender in everybody, in the soul of your nation. Something that you talk a lot about, and it's actually, we've got the representatives of all those faiths at this table, is this kind of conservative alliance between Jews, Catholics, and Protestants. How do you see that relationship and that kind of coalition as a part of the conservative movement? In other words, how can faiths that have some things in common but are also different be able to kind of regenerate the conservative movement?
That's really what the new book goes far beyond nationalism, and it gives both a history of the conservative movement going back, to like 300 years before Burke, and to the American founding and so on. But a lot of the book is political theory, and when I say political theory, I don't want to scare readers. I think it's not jargon. I think it's pretty accessible. Anybody can understand it. But what I wanted to do was to provide a common foundation for understanding a biblically based Anglo-American conservative tradition, which I also think can have a lot of influence outside of the Anglosphere. From contacts in Europe, and I know Israel pretty well. There are other countries that can learn from this also, but the audience is primarily America and Britain, and what I try to show is that there's always been a very strong tradition of we can call it the common law inheritance, which feeds into the American Constitution. But that common law inheritance is a Christian inheritance. It's Christian. It's very strongly Old Testament oriented, which it's a very interesting thing. Obviously, doesn't scant the New Testament, but the Old Testament is kind of the heart of Christian nationalism and Christian love of nation is tied up with the image of ancient Israel, and thinking, that we're the new Israel, not just in terms of like the heart, like individualism, but our country could be in covenant with God. Our communities could join in this covenant. So the book is actually, it's aimed to do that. It's aimed to, I don't hide the fact that I'm Jewish, and and you're absolutely right that there are very, very deep differences between Judaism and Christianity, and between different kinds of Christian movements, but there is a common base, I think, and that common base begins with an understanding for why we need God as part of our politics, and goes from there to an anthropology, meaning a view of human beings, not as dissociated atoms, but human beings who are born into families. Families are, when they're functioning well, they're part of a broader congregation or community, and those congregations are part of, you can call them tribes. I mean, we don't like to use the word so much anymore, but those tribes obviously exist in America just like in every other country. And a nation is diverse. It's always diverse because it consists of, it's an alliance of these of these big tribal or groupings, these large loyalty groups, and so there's a place in America for Protestants and Catholics, and also for Jews and for other kinds of groups, within an alliance that makes up a nation. But to make that stick, and I think a lot of the issue is learning to think again about the need for these different groups to be loyal to one another, the need for competing political parties to be loyal to one another. I mean, what we're seeing today in the United States is simply the dramatic weakening, almost to the bursting point, of the bonds among the different tribes, which make it possible for the nation to function as a whole, and to go forward and preserve itself and grow stronger. So there is a common base, at least I can see it, but we need to return to it. We need to restore it. That's not going to be simple. Let me give you one obvious example. Minorities, like Orthodox Jews in America, I think need to be supportive of efforts to establish a Christian public life in those parts of the country where that's still possible. There's not going to be
Probably not going to happen in California.
Right. There's not. Look, I know on the right there's all sorts of people selling this kind of snake oil of sure, let's just have a dictatorship, but I think it's kind of fantasy, because I think they don't understand how what it would actually take to get to dictatorship, and what would be left if it were there. So I think that people who have any kind of sense of what is not what is decent, just what could possibly work, have to see a restoration of a strong Christian public presence, public life, as the only answer for restoring America. Mm-hmm. I mean, the other roads that are that people on the far right are offering, those are roads that will destroy everything that exists.
So a couple of deeper questions on this. So one of the elements of the kind of nationalism that you support is its particularism depending on the country and place that you're talking about. And so you've often spoken about sort of two elements that would be particular to American nationalism, namely its sort of Anglo-American heritage and then also the Protestant roots of this country. Those are things that are not often emphasized and certainly haven't been, I would say, in the conservative movements as it's existed in Nick and I's lifetimes. Now, why do you think both of those particular characteristics are important to emphasize, and what do they bring to the table without which project will not succeed?
Well, look, I want to be careful about the Protestant roots of the country. The United States certainly is, like Britain for many centuries, has been a country that understood itself and drew its values from Protestant tradition. I don't think that it's impossible. I think it often happens in history that a strong nation can add new tribes to itself. It's not a simple thing to do, okay? Because the natural human tendency is for human loyalty groups to compete with one another, and let's take a simple example like marriage. In a marriage, you think, the husband and wife are always working together and the children are supposed to be like this harmonious, doing what their parents tell them. But that's not actual human life. Actual human life is husbands and wives, even if in the best marriages they bicker. What are they doing when they're bickering? They're jostling for sort of position in terms of, the economy of honors within the family. Who's going to receive more honor? Who's going to have more influence? Who's going to, get to make decisions? And all these things happen among the kids too. The kids are, real kids, not imaginary ones. Real kids that they're always fighting. They're always trying to, to get ahead and to be like a little bit more recognized and a little bit more in charge than their brothers and sisters. And the thing to understand about human collectives in general, which again, this kind of thing is very basic to political theory, but we rarely talk about it, is that human beings compete up until the point where there's some kind of threat or collective effort which brings them back to their loyalties. Okay, and this is as hardwired as anything there is. We'll compete until there's a greater project that brings us together, and then we stop competing and we're on the same side and we fight against or in favor of what we need to fight for. The idea that somehow all this competition and all this bickering can be separated from the state and privatized so that there's no dominant, there's no dominant group. This is like it's a fantasy, and it's an incredibly destructive fantasy. America flourished when it had a dominant a dominant group and a dominant culture, and that was Protestant. And I certainly sympathize with Catholics or Jews, with Black Americans, with others who felt that that they didn't have a good place within that society, right? I mean, a lot of the objections are, they're completely well taken, but it doesn't change the fact that if there's no dominant group, which is setting the tone, then the domestic peace becomes a much more aggressive competition, a much more violent competition. And it'll continue like that until somebody wins dominance. Mm-hmm. And so, I think it's just denial about human nature to think that, what we need to do is create a neutral state. There are no neutral states. And trying to create the neutral state first ended the Protestant hegemony and replaced it with a liberal hegemony, which lasted just a few decades. And now, as of 2020, that liberal hegemony has also collapsed. And what's trying to the strongest force trying to impose hegemony right now is this neo-Marxist woke thing, which it'll destroy all of us. And I think so I think the first thing that that Protestantism, or maybe it'll be a Protestant Catholic alliance. I mean, I think that's more likely, is that Protestants and Catholics will come to some kind of vision of what they're going to do together. But in any case, it's going to have to be a matter of restoring public Christianity. What does that give? It gives society a tone and a direction which is able to hand important things down from generation to generation. So certainly that's God and Scripture and religion. But I think people fail to understand that religious traditions, I mean, these are the same traditions that also uphold the American Constitution, for example. Mm-hmm. You get rid of the traditional Protestant view or Christian view. You get rid of that, and who actually is left supporting the American Constitution? So people say, "Oh no, the liberals were supportive of it," but it doesn't last. I mean, the whole problem we're dealing with is again, what would you need to be able to conserve something? Mm-hmm. And to be able to conserve something, there has to be a predominant culture which knows how to conserve, which is about conserving, which inculcates day to day, hour to hour, passes things down to its children. Mm-hmm. And that's not the neo-Marxist woke thing. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're not about passing down anything. They're not even about passing down their own things. Mm-hmm. Every 5 years, they're going to be about something else, because they're a nonstop revolutionary movement. Mm-hmm. And liberalism itself is also it's a kind of revolutionary movement. If you take it, if you strip it of the Christianity and the biblical basis, which is holding it in place, liberalism also becomes a revolutionary movement, and it pretty quickly turns into this Marxist stuff.
So I have a question. So the kind of society you've described, with a sort of dominant Christianity that infuses the entire culture, seems to me very capable of taking an already Christian civilization and preserving the ability for families to pass that down to their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren. It creates the space where sort of that cultural and religious continuity can exist. What happens when that continuity is broken? I mean, if you look at the rates of religiosity amongst millennials and Generation Z and even Generation X, it's craterously low.
Yep.
And so those people have nothing to pass on to their children.
Right.
And so imposing public Christianity post fact to that set of people, maybe it'll create some speed breaks on the nonstop cultural revolution around us, but you can't revive something that's already dead. How do you answer that? I mean,
I agreed with everything up to the last sentence. Mm-hmm. I mean, you're certainly right that something that is totally dead is not, it becomes,
you can't conserve it. Well, what's
right,
there to conserve?
It becomes the dust of history. Mm-hmm. But I think a common, and I said before that, I mean, I think we're talking at this stage about what can be done in those areas that still have Christian majorities. Mm-hmm. And that's an important point, because restoring a Christian majority in a Christian public life in states and parts of the country where there's still a strong Christian majority, or at least a pro-Christian majority, that's one issue, and that's not imposing, right? I mean, I'm describing something different we're not talking about a overthrowing the American Constitution and putting in some kind of Christian dictator, who's going to by force re-Christianize everybody. I mean, this is all nonsense. Americans, I mean, there's no conceivable constellation in which Americans can do that. What is conceivable, and I'm not saying that it's easy, but what is conceivable is that parts of the country can recognize that the experiment of de-Christianization, which began in the 1940s and reached its pinnacle by the 1970s, that experiment in de-Christianizing the public sphere in America has simply destroyed the country. It's on a path to bringing complete ruin and the dissolution of the state and the people. And if people can understand that, then what we're talking about is a revival and a restoration. And a revival and a restoration, it has to be based first and foremost on leadership who themselves are going through some kind of restorative process. Mm-hmm. Okay, in other words, I don't expect people who are live a completely libertine life, or completely liberal life, and they themselves have no idea what transmission from generation to generation is about. I don't expect them to be able to pull this off, which means that we have to be talking, and we don't have a lot of time. So we have to be talking about two things happening simultaneously. One is in those areas where it's still possible, the promotion of things like returning Bible to the school system and a public orientation to on social issues, which is which takes its tone from the Christian moral vision. That's one thing, but at the same time, that's not going to work if we don't have some significant part of the public taking a look at themselves and their own lives and saying, okay, like I support conservative causes, but actually my life is completely liberal. And I actually don't know anything about conservation and transmission. The only way to change that is to join an Orthodox congregation, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, Orthodox, Christian, other. But you need to find a place where the active daily transmission of the traditions is taking place. And you as an individual, you need to come to that congregation, not with a feeling of, this is going to be some peripheral thing on the side. You need to come to it with an attitude, I would say an attitude of an openness to repentance, an openness to saying, I've actually been doing things wrong. And my goal here is not to, be an equal to this congregation. My goal here is to learn. And and you can do this at any age. I mean, older people can also do this. It's not only young people, but the crucial thing is to understand that in healthy functioning Orthodox congregations, the old hierarchies are still there, to some significant extent or to a very great extent. And when you join to learn. You've come to give honor to something that you don't understand. I mean, it's certainly not a requirement that you believe and that you know the traditions before you're even a member. But you come there to learn. You come there saying, transmission of the great and the good things of our past has ceased around me. I'm living in a barren place. I want to be part of that transmission. Again, that means you come to the congregation as someone who is coming to give honor to things you don't understand. And when you give honor, then you become open to the possibility of learning. Once you start learning, hopefully you'll marry within that church, within that synagogue, and then you'll learn from people who have handed down the traditions how to build a family that is itself a traditional family, because almost no one knows how to do it in sort of general liberal society anymore. Mm-hmm. You get to that point yourself, then your public activities, right? I mean, I'm not saying that this is a retreat from public life, but when you're doing this in your personal life, your public life then becomes infused with a wisdom you just don't have. Mm-hmm. And we need a lot of people to do that. I'm not saying everybody needs to do that, but there needs to be a significant revival on the personal level. That's the key to the public life. Without that, it's not going to happen.
So I want to pick up on this because I think you're making a very interesting and important point that not a lot of our watchers or listeners may have heard before. There's this pastor that I've listened to in the Midwest, recently took the helm of a small church in a rural community. And one of the things that he talks about is kind of this influx recently over the last couple years of these kinds of people that are not normally welcomed in like traditional evangelical churches. And we're talking about truckers, people who work on farms, guys that wear, Confederate flag vests to the mall, like different people that a lot of like suburbanites and, people that live in the city would kind of look down on. And something that he's talked about in his conversations with these parishioners has been that many of them grew up in nominally Christian homes, right? Like they may have been baptized as babies and they had like a general set of rules, but didn't really grow up in the faith. And in the last couple of years, there's been this huge resurgence for them of like, there's just, I'm seeing all this Trump stuff happening and I'm hearing about all these things on the news. And I feel like there's gotta be something more to this conservatism thing, something that I'm missing. And so this guy's church is just like, it's like doubled in size in the last 6 months because all these, truckers are bringing their buddies to church and they're all getting involved and they're doing grill outs. It's very, very cool to hear about. But I want to ask about, I think a lot of people in DC chalk up this, oh, there we go, it fell. Chalk up this kind of new conservative movement to class distinctions. I think a lot of people in DC, it's a theme I see quite frequently, of people saying, oh yeah, it's this like middle to lower class revolution. Like it's because people feel like they've been unfairly treated economically. Yep. This is just an economic issue. If we fix the economics of it, then everyone will be happy again. How do you think that misses the point?
Well, I'm not sure it does miss the point. I mean, I'm not much of a class warrior, because having a nationalist perspective means that your aim actually is some kind of unity, which means some kind of accommodation, which means compromise, right, between different parts of society. So that can be, different religious groups or different ethnicities, but it's also between classes. Sorry. But I'm not blind, and I understand that the more educated classes in America and in most Western countries at this point are hopelessly swimming in this kind of spectrum from liberal to Marxist or liberal to woke ideas, and that makes it almost impossible almost impossible to imagine them participating in anything like the kind of restoration that we're talking about, either personally or nationally. So in practice, the reality is that for the time being, this is going to have a lot to do with class. I mean, just let's take something simple like the Bible. When I'm not talking political theory, I've written a couple of books on the Bible. I have taught seminars on Scripture for many years, both theology and political theory of Scripture, and that's what I want to see being taught in universities. I mean, not as the only thing, but for me, a very big part of the destruction of the universities is the creation of a world of departments in which political theory is taught without Scripture. As though the Bible is not a foundational part of American and Western political thought, and you can say that about many other departments in the universities. So I would love to see that kind of thing happen, but it's not happening. The opposite is happening. Conservatives are being driven out of it, out of academia. They're allowed to retire. Sometimes in peace, sometimes in humiliation, and they're not being replaced by new conservatives. And so what that means is that anybody who goes to get educated is educated towards thinking that Bible and religion is primitive. That to talk about Scripture is to be a primitive, uneducated person. That's what the universities implicitly teach or explicitly, and so the number of people in those settings who are even if privately their heart reaches out to Christianity and they become a penitent and they become a convert or whatever, and or they start going to Orthodox Jewish services and they found their home there. Still, in their public persona, they're not going to talk about this stuff because they're scared to death that everybody's going to think that they're a primitive. Okay, so in that situation, it is going to be apparently just overwhelmingly a matter of the less educated public. Less educated doesn't mean that they're less intelligent. It doesn't mean that they're less moral. It doesn't mean anything about the quality of the people, other than that they haven't been sucked into this brainwash machine that says you can only be a decent person if you're some kind of progressive. So there are tremendous, strong, powerful reasons why this is taking on the appearance of a class war, a class struggle. As I said, I'm not in favor of that, but I think in practice that that it's the people who feel like they've been left out, that the things that they care about, that their parents or grandparents cared about, have been thrown aside, that they're not taken seriously, they're being taken advantage of. There's a much better chance to see them become the force that changes the balance on this restoration that we're talking about.
Zooming out to the national question, if the goal is to establish some sort of unity, I mean, that's the goal of the left as well, right? Like, they're playing for the whole pie. They're not interested in creating Marxist utopias in the several states. Their project is national and even international in scope, and it's quite imperialistic. And so if that makes it an unstoppable force, do you think that there is weakness built into a vision of the right that's just trying to preserve a sort of a Christian civilization in red states? Do you think that ultimately is a tactical error, and that you need a more imperialistic vision to fight an imperialistic vision?
Well, you're right. That's not actually my vision. My actual vision is international. I chair the Edmund Burke Foundation. The Edmund Burke Foundation operates in quite a few countries at this point. It's our aim is an alliance of independent nations, as FDR once put it, God-fearing independent nations, and we operate within the democratic framework. We're not, we're not interested in Putin supporters or in Xi supporters. We're looking for to advance a vision of democratic nations allied and under God. And but to get back to the practical question, of what's the point of this restoration of public Christianity and conservative tradition in states where it could happen, or in European countries where it could happen. And I think that's the reason for thinking in that way for the immediate future, is because that's the only route that I can see that will allow experiments in what would a state or country governed with a thick Christian and biblical conservatism, what would it look like? Because it's very easy to invent, angelic utopian fantasies and dystopian nightmares, and all of it is sort of beside the point, because until you actually have, examples, and I think this is, this is why so many, conservative intellectuals in the States and in Europe have been, going and visiting places like Poland and Hungary. It's not, not because the and Israel, I think, also is an example that goes there. It's not because you can simply adopt what's going on in any of those countries to the United States or to another. I mean, you can't simply transfer what works in one country is not necessarily something that's going to work in another country. But the reason people are going there is because they want to see what does conservative democracy look like.
Right.
So we're against Putin and we're against Xi, and we don't want the woke thing, and we know that the hegemony of liberal ideas just collapses into the woke thing. So we need something else, but we also need to know that we can respect it. We need to know that we can actually like it and live with it. And so in the United States, I think the clear route is start constructing models of conservative democracy in American states, and let's see it perform. Let's see it happen. This is what federalism was supposed to be about. Is let's do the experiment and see, does it turn into an intolerable repressive theocracy like our like our detractors say, or actually is it a better model? Maybe it'll turn out that you run that experiment and people start flocking to go live there. Maybe
the kingdom of Ron DeSantis being the best example.
Right. Well, it's the beginning. I mean, I don't know if it's yet conservative democracy, but the DeSantis gives us an example of what a governor can do when he has clear vision and a significant coalition behind him. Let's do more of that. And if it's successful, then others will imitate it. Others will be inspired. It'll domino effects don't always work in the direction of people becoming more Marxist. Having successful conservative democracies, Christian democracies, will inspire people and move them to bring it up to in other places, and that's the only choice, the only way to restore anything without war.
Yeah.
So let's try that.
Tell us a little bit about the Israel example, because until I would say the last 10 years, when Hungary and Poland, some of the Visegrad states, and others really kind of came into their own, Israel was basically the only example of a first to second world country that was kind of in the West that didn't hate itself and didn't want to commit national suicide every month. Why do you think that is? What do you think the governing elements of that were? What do you think the cultural elements of that were? And the policy elements, I would say, as well.
Well, I appreciate the positive description. I have to correct it just a little bit. In 2000, I wrote a book called The Jewish State, which was in large part a history of the idea of Israel as a Jewish national state. And it's, I think it's highly accessible to and interesting to non-Jews and non-Israelis because of the fact that you do get to see how the model works. But part of the reason I wrote the book was because of the because by the 1970s, Israel's academics were largely hostile to the country that they lived in. Mm-hmm. And in fact, until recently, I just thought that Israel, in that respect, the intellectuals just, opposing the national and religious traditions of their own people. Until recently, I thought that Israel was, way ahead of America. In fact, in the last few years, America's, and Britain have bypassed Israel and now are much worse. But the same problem that the intellectuals and the elites flock to liberalism, and then their liberalism turns into something significantly more aggressive and worse. Israel's also an example of that. Mm-hmm. So what is true about Israel is that Israelis still have, and I'm taking the broad population rather than the elites, but even some in the elites, Israelis still have a love of nation, meaning a love of the Jewish people and a love of the Israeli nation as the Israeli national state as the expression of the Jewish people and its history.
It's not like the United States where it's like déclassé to like your own country quite yet.
In certain circles it is, but those circles are small. Mm. Okay, so the broad public is pro-Jewish and pro-Israel, to different degrees and in different ways, but broadly I think that's true. Mm-hmm. There's a clear sense that serving in the military is, it's a duty. I mean, people can get out of it if they really want to get out of it, they can get out of it. But most people do serve in the military for years, and they do have children. I mean, the Israel's kind of a miracle in the Western world because it's the decline of the birth rate in Israel has reversed itself, and for the last 20 years, the Jewish population in Israel is having more children every year than the previous year. God willing,
that's still true to this day. Wow.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. So the Jewish birth rate is now it's just nudging over 3 children per family.
Wow.
Which means that it's it's almost double where the United States is is apparently reaching, and it's much more than double most European countries, and and that's across the spectrum. Mm-hmm. And religious families do have more children, but the growth is not taking place. Like the increasing birth rate is not taking place in the religious sector. Mm-hmm. It's taking place in the general public,
the middle of the bell curve.
Yeah, which is just people who are at least at that level rejecting liberal individualism and saying no, I want a future for the Jewish people and for the state of Israel, and having a future for the things I believe in means I have to have children. I have to raise them.
Do you think that the geopolitical situation Israel finds itself in over the last 60 years, where it's sort of attacked from all sides. It's constantly under threat of missiles flying over. Do you think that is part of what coheres Israel as a nation and gives people the sense of urgency to live like that? Do you think that if there was a sustained period of peace, some of that would attrit away? I mean, how do you think about that factor?
I think it is a factor.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's unfortunate. You know, I'd like to say, you know, that you don't need war in order for people to care about, you know, their nation surviving and handing down the traditions. But I think that we had an experiment. It wasn't an experiment with peace. It was an experiment with a, you know, with a false vision of, you know, like a messianic hope in the 1930s. Not 1990s. And to understand it, Israel in the 1990s and its turn to what was called post-Zionism, and which was really an abandonment of the Jewish heritage of the country, and a desire to abandon the borders and to create a new Middle East that would be like Benelux, you know, like the European Union. I'm not kidding. There was a large part of the public that was swept up in Shimon Peres, you know, who was an important political figure, sometimes prime minister. You know, a great man who did lots of important things for Israel. But he wrote this book in 1995 called The New Middle East, and his vision was that you know, liberal secular Jews would link up with liberal secular Arabs, and together they'd fight the fundamentalists, and we wouldn't need borders. There'd be like a you know, like nations would end, and it was the same as the vision in Europe.
The UN's pipe dream.
It's the John Lennon thing, and no, but look, how did this happen? You have to see Israel then as part of this great utopian wave that swept, you know, the entire democratic world. And the Berlin Wall falls in 1989. The Soviet Union is gone in 1991. And by 1991, you have, you know, George H.W. Bush talking about how, you know, his new world order. You go back and read that speech. I mean, I'm sorry, it's like deranged. He's like saying, for 1,000 generations, mankind has sought, you know, and has failed. But we in this generation, we're going to bring the entire world. We're going to end the rule of the jungle. We're going to bring the entire world under law. So that if you don't understand that there was this, you know, drunken feeling of godlike power, that anything was possible, and plenty of you know, I don't know what to say, just kind of weak minds that were so caught up in this arrogance and this inflated ego thing that they really thought that all of human history was going to come to an end, and you know, peace would rule the planets, and they were going to do it. And this is the explanation for how the Treaty of Maastricht and the establishment of the EU under a single constitution, which, you know, was obviously rolling in the federalist direction, and a lot of people are still pushing that, the left in Europe. It was the moment when the decision was made: we'll give back Hong Kong. We'll bring China into the World Trade Organization. We'll have free trade. It'll turn China into a liberal democracy. So at that moment of, you know, absolute detachment from reality, Israel also detached from reality, and the Israeli left thought that they were going to, you know, make peace with terrorist organizations, and the Israeli fantasy that, you know, the war was permanently over lasted from 1993 until 2001. I mean, so in a certain sense, I mean, it was horrible. But in a certain sense, Israel was awakened more quickly than the rest of the world because by 2001, these reckless peace overtures had brought active international terrorist organizations in up to Israel's borders, meaning I'm sorry, up to the borders of Israel's cities, right outside Tel Aviv, right outside Jerusalem, and Haifa and Beersheba. And 2001, we started getting suicide bombers literally every day on public buses, in the cafes, in every major place in Israel. That lasted for 4 or 5 years, and by the time it ended, there weren't any utopians left. No significant politician was a leftist utopian who thought we're just bringing universal peace. So the question you asked before is very astute. When did the dropping Israeli birth rate turn around and become a rising Jewish birth rate in Israel? And the point of the point when it turned is 2001. So, that's not a coincidence.
Right.
People, you remember we talked a little bit about people compete with one another until a threat or an enterprise from the outside forces them to unite. And at least this particular 8 years looked exactly like that. It looked like, people saying, I don't owe my country anything. I don't, and I don't owe my tradition, my religion. I don't need to have children. That was the direction, for that decade. And as soon as the bombs started going off in the cafes, as soon as you knew that you literally didn't know if you were going to see your kids again at the end of the school day because you didn't know that there wouldn't be a bomb going off on their bus. And at that point, people just started having more children and knew they have to fight. And it's hard for people to understand. Children are not they're not only, a means of self-expression, that's like optional. Like, do you feel like, having fun with a small child or not for the next few years? Children are a lifelong commitment. You never stop being their parents. They never stop needing you. When they have families of their own and they start having children, they need you even more than they needed you before. That's a lifelong commitment. And because it's a lifelong commitment, and you don't know who your children are going to be. You don't know whether they're going to be brilliant and superstars at stuff, or whether they're going to be alcoholics or have other severe problems. You don't know. Like, God's deciding this, and so it's an act of faith. It's a huge act of faith to have a child. The faith that you and your wife are going to be together around, for all the decades till the end, to be there to help that child, that act of faith, it turns out that it's not, you can't separate it from faith in your nation, faith in your God, faith in your. I'm not saying every person who has a child has believes in God, but these things they're integrally connected in such a way that people who are having children, it's much easier for them to begin to believe in God, and people who care about their nation, it's much easier for them to have children.
The other element of Israeli society that I find interesting, there was a recent piece by, I think, Leah Leibowitz on the economy of Israel, what it was like for the tech sector, the venture capital industry, the sort of rising high-tech economy in Israel, and what that has done to the sociological and cultural and religious texture of the country. He makes an argument that it is ultimately the poison pill that could lead to Israel's decline, that it'll just become another Silicon Valley. What do you make of that aspect of it, the potential downsides of the material prosperity that Israel has enjoyed?
Well, I generally agree with Liel's picture. I think it was a very fine essay. I think that that the warning that prosperity can come with downsides is apt, and it's important. But I don't think avoiding prosperity is the answer. Irving Kristol, who had a big influence on, as I said, on the Princeton Tory. He was, I think he regarded himself as still hanging on to liberalism, but his essays were ferociously critical of liberalism, and the reason is because he considered the market and the sort of like the unbridled freedom. He considered that to be a kind of a universal solvent that would wreck every bond of loyalty, every tradition, every bond of loyalty, every kind of, a willingness to think of something larger than yourself. He saw that in operating in the free market, and he said it's conservatism has to be built on three things: religion first, nationalism second, and economic growth third. That doesn't mean that he didn't, support the free market as the best engine for economic growth. Economic growth is, it's not only good, because it's better for people to eat well, and it's better for people to, to have more options. But even if you were only looking at it from the perspective of, the survival of your nation in a world of competition, you need economic growth. Economic growth is what allows you to defend yourself, to defend your borders, to do anything that you need to do. So I don't have any inclination to turn against economic growth, but the change that we need is to look at it in terms of what does it do for the nation. Mm-hmm. And this is I go into this issue at some length in my new book on conservatism, that in the Anglo-American tradition, the conservative tradition, individual liberties are crucial, but they're only one principle. If you look at the preamble to the American Constitution, there's seven different principles, seven different purposes that are described as the aim of the American national government. One of them is securing the blessings of liberty, but
which is different than just liberty qua liberty.
You can say that, but even if you just grant that one, to the libertarians, fine. But look at it. It's balanced against a concern for the general welfare. It's balanced against the capacity to mount a common defense. It's balanced against the first purpose of the American Constitution is a more perfect union. And a more perfect union is, that is talking about that reflects the experience of the Americans during 11 horrible years of trying to wage a war of independence in a condition where 13 different countries, the 13 states were 13 independent countries. There was no capacity for national taxation. There was no capacity to raise a national army. There was no capacity to enforce treaties. If you're going to have a peace treaty, then there's no way to make the states actually participate in the peace treaty. I think people just don't understand this. That the first American Constitution, the most liberal, freedom-oriented, rationalist Constitution was the one of 1777, which people call the Articles of the Confederation. And that Constitution brought America to the point where in order to move troops to Yorktown, they had to raise money for private individuals. They had like private people writing checks to make it possible to move the armies. I mean, you cannot live like this. You actually need to have a strong national government for some purposes. That doesn't mean that you need 4 million employees getting into every aspect of people's lives, but the idea of a strong national government and a constitution that makes it possible. So take a look, think about what a more perfect union as a goal of government is. The goal of government there is to create national cohesion. It's to figure out, what do you need to do? What's the economy of honors among the different tribes, the different states, what do you need to do to bring them into loyalty to one another? What you need to give something to each of them. They need to start talking differently. What can you do in order to get to the point where somebody from Massachusetts and somebody from California, let's say somebody from Massachusetts and somebody from Alabama say, yeah, I'm loyal to this union. That's the first purpose of government, and so of course we have these strong traditions of individual liberties. And they're wonderful in many ways, but they have to be limited by other principles. Otherwise, you're just a utopian. You'll wreck your country.
Dr. Hazony, you have many critics, and I find the kind of left-leaning ones ultimately uninteresting, but the right-leaning ones kind of come in 3 broad categories. And I think there's lots of people who just argue these things in bad faith because you're doing something, and people are always jealous of people that are doing something. But entertain us on this. So the category of people who think that you misunderstand the founding, the category of people who believe that America was rotten from the beginning and that it's an inherently liberal project and it's destined to failure. And then the category of people who are like, what's a Jewish guy from Israel doing telling us Americans how to live in America? What's your answer to each broad category of critiques to close us out?
Well, let's start with Jewish guy from Israel. First of all, I was born in Israel. I grew up in New Jersey, and I was educated at Princeton and Rutgers, 2 lovely liberal universities. And my wife and I moved to Israel after university. We raised our family there. I served in the Israeli military. My children serve in the Israeli military. And, for a lot of my career, my primary concern and what I did with my time was worrying about, this little Jewish country perched at the edge of a volcano. And, my wife and I and our friends, we just thought that was the front line. We thought that Israel was in weak shape, and that America was in pretty good shape, and Europe was in good shape, and that was the right place to make a stand. And my life changed in 2016 when one of my professor mentors called me up in February of 2016 and said, Yoram, put everything you're doing aside and write the book on nationalism because we need it. This is an American professor who had known me for years. And I looked at what was happening, and I saw America and Britain tearing themselves apart internally, just descending into hatred and dysfunctionality. And I felt like if I didn't write that book on nationalism, then who was going to write it? And it's turned out like that. I mean, there are some other good books on nationalism from that time. Rich Lowry has a take that's much more, that's a lot more more liberal, we can say, than mine. But it's a very good book. But I think that what I saw then has just turned out to be true, that I only go where I'm invited, and I, since writing The Virtue of Nationalism, there's no end to people in America and in European nations and elsewhere who want me there, and they want me there because they want to restore, they want to return, they want to strengthen their countries, and they feel like I'm expressing something that speaks to them. And I'll tell you something funny about this international. It's basically turning into a like kind of like a nationalist international.
Yeah.
That in all these different countries, people want to hear about national conservatism, and they hear it and they say,
sounds pretty good.
That's it. That's what we need.
Yeah.
So I'll tell you something really funny about this Orthodox Jewish thing, is that a lot of people have told me, we wouldn't trust the nationalists from other countries. We trust ourselves, but the nationalists in that other country, and they name some other place, we don't know if we can trust them, but you're an Orthodox Jew and we trust you. And if you are vouching for these ideas, and if you're checking into these people, now I just want to say that that doesn't mean that I and my colleagues in the Edmund Burke Foundation, I don't want to say we never make mistakes. We're working hard on this, but we work really hard in order to bring together people who are conservative and nationalist and inclined to faith, but have no truck with Putinism, with dictatorship, with fantasies of how Xi has the key to running the world. We are not interested in white identitarians, and we're not interested in basically the attempt to run a right-wing revolution that's not conservative. The attempt to throw out everything that 1,000 years of Anglo-American experience trying to build a biblically oriented society that is both just and free, throwing all of that out in order to experiment with Caesarism. Like we work hard to find the people who are on board with this program. And people really do. It's strange, but many people really do trust me because I'm Jewish, and some of them admire Israel, but some of them they just think that they feel that an Orthodox Jew would be more careful than other people. So. Look, I'm not going to go where I'm not going to go where I'm not wanted, and as long as people keep saying, people like Tom Paine, and Jefferson, went to France in order to help them with their horrible revolution. So I think it's reasonable to say, if Americans or Brits or others, if they need help and they think my services would be helpful, then I want to help them. I mean, in the end, we are all fighting one fight.
Dr. Hazony, how can people find you? This episode's coming out after your book is released. Where can people find everything that you're up to?
Well, there's a personal website, yoramhazony.org. If you want to follow me and my writings, it's there. Probably more important is nationalconservatism.org, which is it's a clearinghouse website that has new books, new videos. It's updated daily with new essays being written by people in our movement from America and abroad. And come take a look. NatCon 3. Our annual bash will be in Miami this year, September 11th through 13th, and I hope that you and all your friends are going to be there.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Dr. Hazony, for coming on the podcast, taking time out of your busy schedule here, and thank you for everything that you do.
I would go as far as to say that was one of the best interviews of Dr. Hazony that I've seen. He hosts a podcast where he does a lot of long-form interviews, but he's not often on the other end of that, certainly not from a friendly perspective. There's not that many friendly podcasts to his perspective, so we were really honored to be able to do that. If you're listening to this in the week that it publishes, there is a book launch event happening that I'm sure you can find. The Intercollegiate Studies Institute is putting it on. The book is out. You should definitely go buy it, and be sure to engage with all the great work they're doing over at National Conservatism Conference. Go to National Conservatism Conference later this year. I believe it's in Miami, and they have a save the date up for sometime in the fall.
It's September 11th through the 13th.
Okay.
Very good with dates.
There you go. And so we'll probably be there, and we'll have a lot of friends there too. So highly recommend doing that. As always, rate and review the podcast 5 stars. It really helps us in the rankings. You guys have been trucking away. I went back and looked at how many ratings we have recently, just today actually, and was like, oh, it's like over 120 of them. So you guys are doing what we're asking, and we are sincerely appreciative. Go subscribe on YouTube if you want to see the video version of this podcast. We put in a good deal of effort to make sure that you can see our guests' pretty faces on screen.
YouTube or Rumble if you love America.
That's right. YouTube did take down our Steve Bannon interview, so Rumble is really the main move at this point. And you can follow us on Getter too when we're doing the alt tech plugs. You can subscribe to our email lists at AmericanMoment.org. You can see the stuff we're putting on AmCan in the backlog of this podcast. Tons of stuff always going on. Potentially some parties coming up in the summer. Just keep an eye out, and we'll see you guys next week on Moment of Truth. Moment of Truth is an American Moment Studios production filmed at the Conservative Partnership Center. Our podcast is produced and edited by Jake Mercier and Jared Cummings. Our intro music is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich. Don't forget to like and subscribe on all platforms, and you can go to AmericanMoment.org to learn more.